I am really delighted to welcome Dr. Mark Hatzenbuehler to Rhodes College. It is in some ways a homecoming because you graduated from White Station High School in 1997, and because your parents are very dear friends to Rhodes College, and your father, Dan, is a member of our Board of Trustees. So it is wonderful to have you here as part of the Rhodes family. Mark is an extremely accomplished man, and we are fortunate that he will bring his work to us. He serves as Associate Professor of Socio-Medical Sciences and Sociology at Columbus University's Mailman School of Public Health. His BA and his PhD are from Yale. And I don't want any of our own faculty to faint. I almost did when I read this. He has published over 110 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters in his area of specialty on the role of stigma in shaping health inequalities. Mark has received several awards for his research, including the 2016 Early Career Award for Distinguished Contributions to Psychology in the Public Interest, the American Psychological Association. His work has been widely covered in the media, including interviews on NPR and MSNBC, and something that I think is very interesting about his work, and maybe we can talk about this in the Q&A portion, is that his work is often cited in court cases and amicus briefs for legal cases that focus on status-based discrimination. So I think we will all have a lot to learn. As someone who has recently been through her own health crisis that carries with it its own versions of stigma, I'm very, very much looking forward to this work. So thank you very much.
Got to move that up. Well, thank you, President Haas, for that very nice introduction, and Kendra for the invitation. As you mentioned, my parents are alumni of Rhodes, and so this place is very special to them, and they're two of my very favorite people. And so, by the transitive property, Rhodes has also become a special place to me. So, it's great to be here and to have the opportunity to share some of the work that my colleagues and I have been doing in the area of stigma and the role that it plays in shaping and determining health inequalities. So one of the images and metaphors that I like to use in talking about stigma is one of the iceberg, which is shown here. So when you think about stigma, you probably think about concrete events and experiences that happen to people. Things like hate crimes or bullying or being the target of stereotypes. And you might also think about some of the psychological responses that stigmatized individuals have to these concrete events and experiences. Things like anticipating rejection, being hypervigilant to threat cues in your environment, or concealing your identity for fear of being rejected or discriminated against. And you wouldn't be wrong for thinking that. Each of those are forms of stigma, and there are now hundreds of studies from social sciences showing that these forms of stigma matter for people's health and well-being. But it also turns out that this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of how stigma operates to produce disadvantage. Stigma is much broader than these concrete events and experiences. It's reinforced and promulgated through our social institutions, through the laws and policies that we choose to pass or not pass, and also through our cultural and social attitudes that we have about members of different stigmatized groups. Collectively, this is what my colleagues and I call structural stigma. And what our work and the work of our colleagues is beginning to show is that these structural forms of stigma that operate just below the surface can have really profound implications for the health and well-being of stigmatized individuals, not only for their mental health, but for their physical health as well. So keeping this image of the iceberg in your mind, this metaphor image is consistent with conceptualizations of stigma in the social science literature, which conceptualizes stigma as a multi-level construct ranging from individual to structural levels. So individual forms of stigma refer to the psychological processes through which stigmatized individuals both perceive and react to stigma. And social psychologists have long been interested in identifying a whole host of individual forms of stigma. I've just shown two here on this slide. One is concealing your stigma from others, that is hiding it, or self-stigma, which refers to internalizing negative societal attitudes about your group and incorporating that into your self-concept. In contrast, interpersonal forms of stigma refer to interactional processes that occur between the stigmatized and the non-stigmatized. So these can include really overt events like bias-based hate crimes, but they can also refer to much more subtle interactional processes like microaggressions. And the vast majority of research on stigma has really existed at these two levels of analysis, that is the individual and interpersonal level. And that work has been really essential in terms of documenting many of the ways in which stigma operates to produce disadvantage. But this work has also been criticized for overlooking broader institutional or structural forms of stigma, which my colleagues and I have defined as societal level conditions, cultural norms, and institutional policies and practices that constrain the lives of the stigmatized. And leading stigma researchers, including my colleague Bruce Link, has called this underrepresentation of research on structural stigma relative to stigma at the individual and interpersonal levels. He calls this a dramatic shortcoming in the literature, as the processes involved are likely to be major contributors to unequal outcomes. And so my program of research has sought to begin to address this important gap in the literature. And when I started this work about a decade ago, I decided that one of the most convincing ways to try and show that structural stigma matters in terms of shaping health and health inequalities is to produce an integrated body of work that uses a multi-measure, multi-method, multi-group, and multi-outcome approach. And the reason for that is relatively straightforward. If you can show that structural stigma contributes to health inequalities across a range of different measures and methods and groups and outcomes, it really improves our confidence that these findings aren't spuriously confounded by any particular measure or method or outcome. And so you'll see in my talk today that we've used a variety of different measures to operationalize and study structural stigma. These include, for example, social policies and social attitudes. You'll also see that we've used a variety of different research methods to study the health consequences of structural stigma. These include observational designs, quasi-experiments, and laboratory designs. And the important point here is that there are strengths and limitations to each of those different methodological approaches, and so what we're looking for here is the ability to triangulate evidence across those different approaches to explore the relationship between structural stigma and health inequalities. With respect to stigmatized groups, as you'll see in the talk today, a lot of our work has focused on structural forms of stigma related to sexual orientation. So I'll be focusing on most of that work in my talk today. But more recently, we've been interested in examining the extent to which this work generalizes to other stigmas, including stigmas related to race and ethnicity. So I'll be covering that towards the end of the talk. And I know that many of the students in this room coming from so many different departments are interested in stigma related to race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and a whole variety of different social axes of stratification. And so I'd encourage you, as you're listening to this talk, to think about how some of this work on structural and institutional forms of stigma that are related to sexual orientation may apply to your own areas of research interest. And perhaps during the Q&A, we can talk about some ways of applying that to the wide range of stigmatized identities and statuses here in the US and globally. And then finally, as you'll see in the talk that I present today, we've shown, and our colleagues have shown now, that the health consequences are really far-reaching for structural stigma. These range from adverse mental health outcomes, including psychiatric disorders and suicide attempts, but they also trickle down into adverse physical health outcomes as well, including some of our work showing linkages to premature mortality that I'll talk about later in the talk. So this is a broad outline of the remainder of the talk, and what I'll do in the first part now is talk about 3 different studies that we've conducted, which is to give you a sense of the range of methods that we've used to explore this topic of structural stigma and health inequalities, so you have a sense of how we've approached this issue. So in the first methodological approach, we've capitalized on the really substantial state-level variation in social policies that differentially target sexual minority populations, or lesbian, gay, and bisexual, or LGB, lots of acronyms, populations here in the US to study some of the health consequences of exposure to structural stigma. We've done this in a variety of different studies. I'll just mention one example that we published several years ago in the American Journal of Public Health. So in this study, our measure of structural stigma was 2 state-level policies. We coded states based on the presence or absence of hate crime laws and employment non-discrimination acts. And we coded those state laws to determine whether they included sexual orientation as a protected class status. And we created a dichotomous variable comparing states with no protective policies versus states with at least one of those 2 protective policies. Hopefully you'll forgive me for perpetuating yet again the red state, blue state distinction. I can't seem to get politics out of my mind these days, but you'll see in red are the states with no protective policies, and states in blue had at least one of these 2 protective policies. This was actually, this is not current, this was for the year 2005 because that corresponded with our outcome data, which I'll mention right now. So what we did is we took this data at the state level and linked it to individual level health outcomes from a data set called the NESARC. This is the National Epidemiologic Survey on Alcohol and Related Conditions. It's a nationally representative survey of non-institutionalized US adults age 18 and over. You can see a really nice large sample size of nearly 35,000 participants. And these are face-to-face interviews. So researchers use semi-structured diagnostic interviews to generate DSM-4 psychiatric diagnoses. So we have mental health outcomes on everyone in the sample. And this was also one of the first large-scale studies in the US to include a measure of sexual orientation identity. And then finally, we knew the state of residence for these respondents. So we had all the ingredients that we needed to examine associations between the social context in which these individuals were embedded as measured by state laws and policies, and how that affected mental health and mental health disparities as they relate to sexual orientation status. So I'll walk you through these results on the, let me see if this pointer was not cooperating earlier. It doesn't look like it's working, that's okay. On the y-axis here is the adjusted odds ratio that indicates the likelihood that LGB respondents met criteria for a psychiatric disorder relative to heterosexuals. So for example, an odds ratio of 2 indicates that LGB respondents are twice as likely to meet criteria for a psychiatric disorder relative to heterosexuals. Thank you. It's not showing up on the screen. Yeah, that's fine. I will use this. I'll go old school. Okay. So on the x-axis are the disorders where we find a significant interaction between sexual orientation and the state-level policies. So let me first start with the results for dysthymia. For those of you who aren't in the mental health profession, dysthymia is a mood disorder. By definition, it's more chronic but less severe than a major depressive episode. I sort of think of it as the Eeyore of mental health problems, this sort of low-grade kind of pessimism and chronic hopelessness. So you can see here that LGB respondents who live in one of those states with protective policies were no more likely to meet criteria for this mood disorder than were heterosexuals in those same states. Or stated in another way, the sexual orientation disparity in this mood disorder was completely eliminated in states with protective policies. In contrast, LGB adults living in one of those states with no protective policies were nearly 2.5 times more likely to meet criteria for this mood disorder than were heterosexuals in those same states, controlling for established risk factors. We find similar results for generalized anxiety disorder. This is an anxiety disorder that's characterized by chronic tension and worry. So you can see here that LGB respondents living in one of those states with protective policies were a little more than 1.5 times more likely to meet criteria for this anxiety disorder than were heterosexuals in those same states. In contrast, LGB adults living in states with no protective policies were nearly 3.5 times more likely to meet criteria for this anxiety disorder. than were heterosexuals in those same states. So I won't belabor the point here, you get the idea. We find similar results with post-traumatic stress disorder and also with psychiatric comorbidity, which is defined as the presence of 2 or more co-occurring psychiatric disorders and is an index of illness severity that's associated with a whole host of adverse outcomes, including suicidality, such that LGB respondents living in states with no protective policies were nearly 5 times more likely to have at least 2 or more co-occurring disorders than heterosexuals in those same states. So the take-home message from this first study and others that we've done like it suggests that sexual orientation disparities in psychiatric morbidity are significantly higher in states that have these structural forms of stigma. But you might be wondering from this study, you might be thinking about a variety of plausible alternative explanations for these findings. And let me just mention 2 of those and how we've done some follow-up analyses to try and address and potentially rule out those alternative explanations. One of those is, well, maybe states with high levels of structural stigma just have a lot more interpersonal discrimination in them. That is, victimization rates, bullying, bias-based hate crimes, et cetera, are probably more likely in high structural stigma states. And so maybe structural stigma is just an aggregate measure of interpersonal discrimination, and so therefore shouldn't exert an independent relationship with psychiatric disorders over and above stigma at the interpersonal level of analysis. Fortunately, we're able to address that question in this NESARC data set because it also included a measure of perceptions of interpersonal discrimination based on sexual orientation. This question asked people the extent to which they perceive that they've been discriminated against in a variety of life domains like education, healthcare setting, employment, and the like. So when we were able to control for that in the analyses, and the direction and magnitude of the results remains largely unchanged. And so this not only suggests that structural stigma appears to be associated with sexual orientation disparities and psychiatric disorders over and above stigma at the interpersonal level of analysis, but also suggests that these results aren't due to an aggregation bias. Another alternative explanation that you may be wondering about is, well, maybe it's just that the healthy LGB respondents leave high structural stigma states and sort into low structural stigma states. That would certainly be a rational response to living in environments with policy regimes that signal threat cues to your social identity. And so the problem for researchers then is that what this would do is it would make it look like the story that social causation is actually due to social selection. And in particular, it's due to social selection by health, such that the healthy respondents are leaving these states, leaving the unhealthy respondents behind. We're not able to test that in the NESARC data set, but we did look to another data set that's nationally representative that also included measures of sexual orientation and health, and importantly, had information on geographic mobility. That is, how much are people moving, and does that differ as a function of your sexual orientation and your health? And interestingly, we find very little, if any, significant differences in sexual orientation, differences in geographic mobility from this data set. So for example, you can see nearly identical percentages of sexual minorities and heterosexuals living in the same city, nearly the same percentage living in different cities within the same state, and also nearly identical percentages who live in different states. But the most important thing from the social selection hypothesis is that this has to be related to health. It has to be that it's the healthy people who are moving, leaving the unhealthy respondents behind in order for our results to not be due to social causation, but due to geographic selection. And in fact, we actually found the opposite in this data set. That is, among those who report being in fair or poor health, sexual minorities are actually more likely to move out of state than heterosexuals. So this is the opposite of what the social selection hypothesis would have predicted. So this result suggests that our results are unlikely to be due to selection effects regarding geographic mobility. Let me shift gears now to a second methodological approach that we've used to examine this research question. So even though this previous study that I presented and others like it begin to show a signal that there are associations between these structural forms of stigma and health inequalities, and that we've tried to address some of these alternative explanations, it's still the weakest in terms of causal designs because these are cross-sectional observational studies. And so in a second methodological approach, we've sought to complement these observational studies through the use of what we call natural or quasi-experiments. And here we've been capitalizing on the rapidly changing policy environment here in the US targeting LGBT populations to conduct these natural or quasi-experiments to test their health consequences of exposure to structural stigma. So the way this works is, I of course can't randomly assign individuals to live in states with or without protective policies. The Institutional Review Board at Columbia is probably going to not let me do that and probably fire me if I tried to. And so I can't conduct traditional randomized lab experiments. And in fact, a lot of the social exposures that we care about in the field of public health, we can't randomly assign individuals for those ethical reasons. But the next best thing is to conduct these quasi or natural experiments. So here we take advantage of naturally occurring changes in structural forms of stigma, in this case, changes in our laws and policies, as an index or a way to study the health consequences of structural stigma. It's actually quite difficult to conduct these studies. You need unique data sets to do this. You need baseline data on your stigmatized group, and then you have to follow them over time after the change in the social policy to see whether their health changes following the implementation or removal of a structural form of stigma. It turns out we're often not very good at anticipating when these laws and policies change, and so we often can't obtain baseline data on our samples, especially in population-based designs. But we've been able to do this in a couple different studies, and I'm just going to present, for the sake of time, one example. So to do this, we need to go back to the year 2004, which, as some of you will remember, during the presidential elections, numerous states passed constitutional amendments banning same-sex marriage, which was our index of structural stigma in this study. And it just so happened that those events occurred in between the two data collection periods of the NESARC, which is the data set that I just mentioned previously. So the NESARC is a longitudinal study. Respondents are first interviewed in 2001, and then the same respondents are re-interviewed again 4 years later in 2005, following the passage of the same-sex marriage bans. And so this creates a natural experiment that enables us to examine changes in the prevalence of psychiatric disorders among the same respondents who have been assessed both before and after the passage of those bans. So let's walk through these results. I'll be, for the sake of time, just presenting the results for mood disorders, but we find similar results for the other anxiety and substance use disorders that we examine. So on the x-axis here, on the y-axis, the prevalence of mood disorders, and on the x-axis is the state of residence. So on the left-hand side here are LGB respondents living in one of those states that banned same-sex marriage, and on the right-hand side are LGB respondents living in one of those states that did not ban same-sex marriage. All right, so in wave one, you can see here that the prevalence rates are nearly identical between these two groups. And that makes sense because this occurs before the passage of the same-sex marriage bans. But now let's take a look at what happens in wave two, which is in 2005, following the passage of those bans. So you can see here we see a 37% increase in mood disorders among LGBT respondents who live in one of those states that ban same-sex marriage, and that's a statistically significant increase. In contrast, we don't see a significant decrease in mood disorders among LGBT respondents living in one of those states that did not ban same-sex marriage. I know 24% decrease looks like a pretty large drop. It turns out that's not statistically significant, although you can see that there is a trend towards a protective effect of living in one of those states that did not ban same-sex marriage. But how do we know that these results are specific to the stigmatized group? That is, how do we know that they're specific to LGBT respondents living in one of those states that enacted this structural form of stigma? Well, another way we can do that is to look at another comparison group. In this case, let's look at what happened to heterosexuals who lived in one of those states that also banned same-sex marriage and look to see what happens to their mental health. So as you just saw on the previous slide, there was a 37% increase in mood disorders among LGBT respondents living in one of those states that banned same-sex marriage. In contrast, there's only a 3% increase among heterosexuals, and that's not statistically significant. So essentially no change in mental health status among the non-stigmatized group, but large increases in psychiatric morbidity among those living in states that enacted these structural forms of stigma. So these results are specific to our stigmatized group of interest. All right, so I'm going to switch gears now to the third study, where we've used, yet again, a different methodological approach to try and triangulate evidence for the public health consequences of structural stigma. And here our approach is somewhat different. We've been capitalizing on unique population-level reductions in structural stigma to study some of the health consequences. So the research question here is relatively straightforward. So if structural stigma contributes to health inequalities related to sexual orientation, then we should see a decline in those disparities or inequalities if structural stigma declines at a population level. So it's a relatively simple and straightforward question, but it turns out it's quite difficult to test empirically because you need a really unique data set that exists within a unique social context. With respect to data, you need repeated health data sets, a data set with repeated measures of health and your stigmatized group of interest, in this case sexual orientation, over time, which is already very rare. But then you also need that data set to exist within a social context that's undergone really pronounced reductions in structural forms of stigma against that group. It turns out that we had to look for about 10 years to find a data set to test this because most social contexts that we looked at either hadn't changed in terms of their structural stigma or didn't have these data sets. But one place that does is Sweden, which over the last 15 to 20 years or so has undergone pretty pronounced changes in terms of its structural forms of stigma related to sexual orientation, including changes in laws and policies, but also social attitudes. So this is showing a timeline here of changes in discriminatory laws and policies in Sweden. You can see in 1999, for example, that discrimination in employment based on sexual orientation was made illegal. A couple years later, in 2003, protections based on sexual orientation are added to hate crime and hate speech laws. And then finally, in 2009, same-sex marriage was legalized within Sweden. And this shift in terms of the country's laws and policies is mirrored in terms of the social attitudes of the Swedish population. So this is showing data from a nationally representative survey of Swedish respondents, showing the percent of Swedish adults that agree or strongly agree with the statement, gays and lesbians should be free to live life as they wish. So you can see a nearly monotonic increase over the last 15 years or so, from 2002 to 2014. Already starts at a very high 82%, much higher than you see here in the US. And then about 10 years later in 2014, you can see that 92% of the general population of Sweden agrees or strongly agrees with this statement. So we've seen pronounced shifts in terms of structural stigma, reductions in structural stigma in Sweden. And then in order to examine whether that's associated with declines in sexual orientation disparities in mental health, we've used data from a data set called the Swedish National Public Health Survey, which starting in 2005, these are nationally representative surveys of Swedish adults, and starting in 2005, they began to measure sexual orientation identity, along with health measures, including measures of mental health. So let me show you the results here. On the y-axis here is the percent that met criteria for elevated psychological distress. And on the y-axis here, on the x-axis are the years of the study. And what I'm first going to show you is the measure of structural stigma that you just saw. So this is just showing you that laws, policies, and attitudes are improving in Sweden over this time period, and therefore structural stigma is decreasing during this time period. And now what I'm going to do is show you the percent that met criteria for elevated psychological distress stratified by sexual orientation identity. And I'm separating gay men and lesbians from bisexuals and heterosexuals. So you can see here that there is a fairly significant decline in the percent of gay men and lesbians who meet criteria for psychological distress over the course of this study. In contrast, you can see that there's a decrease between 2005 and 2010 in terms of the percentage of bisexuals who meet criteria for elevated psychological distress, but then a pretty large uptick again in 2015. And then finally, you can see that there's a very slight decline in the prevalence of heterosexuals who meet criteria for elevated psychological distress over the course of the study. So that's the descriptive statistics. Now let me show you the inferential statistics. So we first conduct an interaction between year and sexual orientation. So what that shows us is that that decline that you see between gay men and lesbians and heterosexuals is significant. So what does that mean? It means that the decline in the proportion that meet criteria for for elevated psychological distress is significantly stronger for gay men and lesbians than it is for heterosexuals. And then most importantly for this research question, we show that the magnitude or size of the disparity is substantially smaller in 2015, and in fact is completely eliminated. So in 2005, gay men and lesbians were about 3 times more likely to meet criteria for psychological distress compared to heterosexuals, but 10 years later, following declines in structural forms of stigma, that sexual orientation disparity has been totally eliminated in the Swedish context, at least for gay men and lesbians compared to heterosexuals. So these results are consistent with this hypothesis that following declines in structural stigma at a population level, whether through changes in laws and policies or attitudes, are associated with declines in health disparities at a population level related to sexual orientation status. So let's switch gears here to the second part of the talk. So far, the studies that I've been presenting have looked at this main effect relationship between structural stigma and health inequalities, showing that structural stigma does appear through a variety of different studies and outcomes. We've shown that structural stigma contributes to elevations in adverse health outcomes and to health inequalities. But this work doesn't answer the important question of how and why. How is it that structural stigma gets under the skin to create these adverse health outcomes? So our work has begun to examine this research question, and we've been testing 2 different pathways. One we're interested in is the extent to which structural stigma contributes to psychological stigma processes that have long been of interest to psychologists, including things like rejection sensitivity, concealment, stigma consciousness, which in turn would predict greater adverse health outcomes. And the second pathway is we're interested in whether or not structural stigma might create elevations in psychological and physiological stress responses that in turn contribute to adverse health outcomes. So what I'm going to do is I actually had planned to show 2 different studies, one for each pathway. I think what I'm going to do is skip ahead and just show you, for the sake of time, the results looking at this physiologic mechanism. So the physiologic mechanism that we've been interested in this study is the HPA axis, which some of you know is important in terms of regulating the body's stress response system. So the HPA axis culminates in the production of cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and that was our outcome of interest in this study. So what we did, this is a very different study from what I'm presenting so far, which are these large-scale population-based data sets. This study, we brought respondents into the laboratory. And one of the benefits here, of course, for lab-based studies is that you have experimental control. So you can examine how prior exposure to structural stigma affects a variety of different psychological and physiologic responses in the laboratory setting. So we had 74 LGBT young adults who had grown up in 24 different states, and I'll mention why that's important in just a minute. And they were told that the purpose of the study was to understand connections between your daily experiences, your bodily activity, and health. So importantly, they didn't have any awareness that the study was about stigma or the other constructs of interest to reduce the potential for reactivity. So our measure of structural stigma in this study is similar to the studies that I've presented so far. As you can see, it includes measures of state-level laws and state-level attitudes, but we also added 2 other components of structural stigma. One was the density of same-sex partner households who live in the state, and the other was the proportion of gay-straight alliances in public high schools in the state to get a sense of the school context surrounding LGBT youth. And we conducted what's called our factor analysis, which lets us see the extent to which these different measures correlate. And the factor analysis showed that, in fact, they do. They're all loading onto this single construct of structural stigma, which just meant we could collapse them all and standardize them and sum them and give each state a score based on the level of structural stigma in that state. And you can see here the distribution of states in the U.S. In terms of the level of structural stigma related to sexual orientation, with lighter scores indicating higher levels of structural stigma, and darker states in darker blue were those states that had lower levels of structural stigma. And so what we did is, after we brought our participants into the lab, we asked them, where did you grow up for the longest period of time between the ages of 10 and 18? And we did that because we know from the developmental literature that this is the time period in which many individuals are first developing an awareness of same-sex sexuality and also beginning to identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, at least to themselves, even if they haven't disclosed their identity to others. And so we knew the state where they had grown up, and we coded that state based on the level of structural stigma in that state. And then they all moved to New York City, which is, of course, as you can see here, in a low structural stigma state. And so the question was, how does prior exposure to growing up in a state with high or low levels of structural stigma, how does that affect your current stress response to a stressor in the lab? So to do that, we used a stress test called the Trier Social Stress Test, which some of you might be familiar with. It's one of the most well-validated stress paradigms. And so after the respondents acclimate to the lab, they're told that you have to give a speech in front of two individuals who are trained in the evaluation of speech. And of course, unbeknownst to them, these are Confederates who we've trained. And we've trained them to only give neutral feedback. So they don't smile, they don't nod. They're sitting behind a desk with notebooks and furiously scribbling. They're furrowing their brows, sort of like some of you are right now, probably bored sitting through my talk so far. So this really heightens, of course, the social evaluative threat nature of the task. And to make it even worse, the speech that you have to give is to talk about a time in which you've been discriminated against or rejected because of your sexual orientation. And you're having to give that in front of two individuals who you've never met before and you don't know their attitudes about your stigmatized group. And to me, if that's not bad enough, the worst part is the 5-minute stress math task at the end of it, where you're given these preposterously high numbers and you have to count backwards by sevens, and if you mess up, the Confederate yells at you and you have to start over again. And so not surprisingly, in a meta-analysis, this Trier social stress test produced the most reliable cortisol response out of all the different paradigms that were studied. And we collect neuroendocrine samples via saliva that we assay for cortisol, and we take that at 3 different time points in the study. So I'm showing you the results here. On the y-axis is the cortisol output, and on the x-axis are the 3 different time points where we took the cortisol assessments in the study. So time 1 was the baseline. This is after they come into the lab and acclimate, but before they do any assessments. Time 2 is the reactivity period, so this is 20 minutes after that speech task begins. And time 3 is supposed to be the recovery period. So this is 20 minutes after the math task ends. And you can see that we're comparing cortisol response among those who had grown up in one of those high structural stigma states versus those who'd grown up in one of those low structural stigma states. And you can see here, controlling for established risk factors, we see this blunted cortisol response among those who grow up in high structural stigma states. And that same pattern of results, this blunted cortisol reactivity, has been observed in numerous samples that have been exposed to really chronic and severe life stressors, including kids who are exposed to childhood maltreatment, and also individuals with post-traumatic stress disorder. So this work suggests in a very preliminary way that the stress of growing up in high structural stigma environments may exert biological consequences that are similar to other chronic life stressors. All right, we're in the home stretch. So I want to end by talking about some future directions for research on structural stigma and health inequalities. I recently wrote a review paper in the American Psychologist that outlined where I think this field needs to move. There's some tantalizing findings now that our lab and many others have started to publish, but there's a lot more that we need to understand about how structural stigma operates to produce disadvantage. And in this paper, I'm now committing every cardinal sin of PowerPoint presentations by putting way too much text up here, and I'm not intending you to read this at all, but rather to show you, this is the table from the study showing all that I think we need to learn about structural stigma. And what I'm going to do instead, in a much more PowerPoint-friendly way, is just choose 3 that I think are particularly interesting and important for advancing this field. And the first is generalizability. So I think we really need more work to expand the structural stigma concept to other stigmatized groups. So as I mentioned, and as I presented thus far, most of our work is focused on structural stigma related to sexual orientation. But we've recently expanded this work to study other stigmatized groups as well. And just one brief example, this is some work that I did with my colleague Brittany Morey, who took the lead on this study. And we were interested in this study in whether Latinos who live in communities with high levels of prejudice against immigrants have heightened mortality risk compared to those who live in low prejudice communities. I should just stop and make the very obvious point that not all Latinos are immigrants, but Latinos are disproportionately targeted by prejudice related to immigration, given the conflation in our national discourse between ethnicity and nativity status. So what we did in this study is we took a data set called the General Social Survey, which is a nationally representative survey, and it's been repeatedly asking people their attitudes towards a variety of different stigmatized groups, including people's attitudes toward immigrants. And we took those 5 items that had been repeatedly assessed, and we aggregate those individual responses up to the community level. So the innovation here is we're not asking Latinos themselves about their perceptions of the level of stigma in their environment, but instead we're actually asking the community residents themselves their own attitudes towards immigrants and aggregating those individual responses up to the community level so that we compare the level of prejudice against immigrants across these different communities. So let me give you a sense of how this data structure was created. I'm showing you here 2 hypothetical communities in the GSS study that differ in terms of their levels of prejudice against immigrants. You can see this ranged from a score of 0 to 5. As I mentioned, there were 5 questions. So you can see relatively low levels in San Francisco compared to relatively high levels of prejudice in Shelby County in Alabama, not Shelby County here. And you can also see that we knew from this data set the number of Latinos who lived in those communities from the GSS. We had measures of ethnicity, so we knew the ethnicity of respondents. And then finally, my colleague linked the General Social Survey to the National Death Index. So we had information on mortality from individuals who had been surveyed in the GSS. And so that enabled us to examine the extent to which those who live in communities characterized by higher levels of prejudice have heightened mortality risk compared to those living in low prejudice communities after controlling for numerous established risk factors for mortality. So let me show you our findings in this study. These are showing you the survival curves and cost proportional hazard models. On the y-axis here is the probability of survival by the end of the study, and on the x-axis is the time in years. And you can see here that Latinos who lived in communities with relatively high levels of prejudice against immigrants died sooner than those who lived in the low prejudice communities, again, controlling for established risk factors. This is some evidence of expanding the structural stigma concept to other stigmatized groups, but I think we need a lot more work like this to really understand the full scope and range of how structural stigma is contributing to health inequalities across a wide range of stigmatized identities and characteristics. A second area that I think we need more work in is in measurement, in particular thinking more about how we measure structural stigma. And we need, I think, in particular to develop some new measurement approaches that address some of the limitations of existing measures in the field. So for example, one of the measures, including the one that I just mentioned, measures structural stigma by getting the measures of attitudes of community residents and aggregating their self-report attitudes up to the community level. One of the obvious limitations of that approach is the social desirability bias. People are not likely to tell researchers their true attitudes towards stigmatized groups, and that may underestimate the true level of structural stigma within a particular context. And so researchers are beginning to develop different measurement strategies that don't rely on self-report, and including our own research group. This is some work that my colleague David Che took the lead on, and he's done some really cool work in this area of using a very different measurement approach, which is going to Google and to big data. So in this study, we collaborated with a former data analyst at Google who uses your Google search terms to develop measures of people's attitudes in a particular community. And in this study, we used Google searches of people's their searches of racial epithets in a particular area, and then aggregate those individual responses up to the community level, and then linked that to a health data set. And we were able to show in this study that African Americans who live in communities with higher levels of prejudice, as measured by this Google search index, had heightened mortality risk compared to those who live in low prejudice communities controlling for established risk factors. So one of the real innovations of this work is that it circumvents these self-report measures because people are less likely to censor their socially unacceptable attitudes on the internet, especially when they don't think researchers like us are watching them. And we're watching you. But there are, of course, limitations to this type of measurement approach, but it does speak to some of the newer ways in which researchers are trying to think about some clever ways of measuring structural stigma that overcome some of the biases of self-report measures. And then finally, a note about interventions. As I mentioned so far, our work has shown that structural stigma contributes to adverse health outcomes on its own directly, but another way that structural stigma might be operating to undermine our health is by reducing the effectiveness of our individual level health interventions. And this is a really cool study that my colleague Alicia Reed did. I told her she should put me on retainer for every talk I give, I talk about her study because I think it's so compelling and so interesting and important in terms of understanding another way in which structural stigma affects health. So this is what she did. She took a meta-analysis of 78 different studies of individual level HIV prevention intervention studies with African Americans. These were behavioral interventions. And she took advantage of the fact that these interventions had been done across the US in communities that differed in terms of the level of prejudice against African Americans in those communities. She measured that in two ways. One was racial residential segregation, and the other was whites' attitudes towards blacks in those communities, as measured by a feelings thermometer. And then what she did is she linked those two measures back into the meta-analysis and reanalyzed the study to look to see whether these interventions were more or less effective in communities with different levels of prejudice. So let me show you her findings. For the sake of time, I'm just presenting the results with the measure of prejudicial attitudes, but she finds similar results for the racial residential segregation measure as well. So on the y-axis here is the effect size of the intervention. Higher scores means those behavioral interventions were more effective. On the x-axis here is whites' attitudes towards blacks. As I mentioned, this is a feelings thermometer, so it's reverse coded. So higher scores indicate lower levels of prejudice. So as you can see here, there's essentially a monotonic relationship between prejudice and effect size, such that as prejudice decreases, the interventions become much more effective. And then conversely, in the highest prejudice communities, the effect size of these interventions is literally zero. They're completely ineffective in the highest prejudice communities. And I think this work is really important because it begins to provide some empirical background for some of our intuitions, which is that our individual level behavioral psychological interventions really flourish in some social contexts, but really fail in others. And this suggests that structural stigma might be one among many potential mechanisms that explain some of the heterogeneity in responses to these interventions. And it also suggests that we need to be focusing our interventions on structural stigma itself in order to maximize the effectiveness of these behavioral interventions. So in conclusion, I'll wrap up now. I've shown through several of our studies that structural stigma is a risk indicator for adverse health outcomes and that it shapes health over and above stigma discrimination at other levels of analysis. Just as a reminder, we've used a multi-measure, multi-method, multi-group, and multi-outcome approach. And in doing so, we've found consistent relationships across these wide range of measures, methods, groups, and outcomes, both our group and other independent research groups as well. And so our ability to triangulate evidence and show that it's consistent across these different measures, methods, groups, and outcomes begins to speak to the robustness of these relationships. And then finally, I just want to mention in terms of thinking about implications and applications of this work, several of these studies have been used in amicus briefs on, in cases on status-based discrimination, including two of the cases I've listed here. So this is just another example of the use of social science data to inform public policies aimed at reducing structural forms of stigma and improving the health of populations. So I'll end there and just quickly acknowledge funding for this work and my many amazing collaborators without whom this work certainly would not have happened. And thank you again so much for the invitation to come and for your attention. And I'll look forward to answering any questions you have during the Q&A. Thanks. Thank you.
So much.
Sure.
I wonder if you have access to data after same-sex legalization, because I think you would expect those mental health disparities to reduce at the state level, where you showed that initially those disparities were increasing right after the same-sex marriage ban.
Yeah. It's coming up. Great. So I don't know if everyone could hear that question, but do we have any data looking at the opposite of the study that I mentioned? So we looked at what happened when studies implement constitutional amendments banning same-sex marriage. What happens with the inverse? Do you actually see health improvements following reductions in structural forms of stigma? In this case, reduction or providing the legalization of same-sex marriage. So I do actually have a study on this, and this came out in some of the work that I did with some lawyers on one of the cases that they asked the same question, and we didn't have any data at that point, but I had access to a data set that would enable us to answer it. So as many of you know, Massachusetts became the first state to legalize same-sex marriage, and we had data from a health clinic that served predominantly gay and bisexual men. And so we went into the medical billing records. So these aren't self-reported records. They're data, objective data from the outpatient billing records. And we examined changes in medical and mental health care use and cost in the 12 months after legalization of same-sex marriage compared to the 12 months before. And as you hypothesize, we see reductions in mental health care use in the 12 months after legalization of same-sex marriage compared to the 12 months before. And similarly, we see a significant reduction in mental and medical health care costs following the legalization of same-sex marriage. And interestingly, we also went back to look at what were the leading ICD-9 diagnostic codes that the doctors were charging after those visits. And the three most frequently charged suggest potential mechanisms here. So we see about a 14% reduction in depression, a 16% reduction in adjustment disorders, and about an 18% reduction in hypertension. So these are all sort of stress-related disorders, suggesting that stress may be one mechanism through which, when you reduce these structural forms of stigma, how it might translate into some of the health outcomes and healthcare utilization patterns that we're observing. So, and then one other study that we weren't involved in, but my colleague Julia Raifman has done a really neat difference in difference design, where she linked measures of same-sex marriage to the youth risk behavior surveillance data set that the CDC does that has measures of sexual orientation among youth and suicide attempts. And she shows really robust protective effects of same-sex marriage laws on suicide attempts among LGBT youth. So a different design, different outcomes, but similar finding.
that are associated to these sort of institutional stigma, because obviously when people have mental health problems, that affects their place of employment, it affects their families and coworkers. They themselves incur medical costs and reduce productivity and so forth. I'm just curious if there's any estimates of economic impact.
Yeah. Great question about the potential, not only looking at some of the health and healthcare consequences, but also potential economic consequences as well. I'm not aware of work that has put a sort of dollar figure to it. I am aware of some research that has used really clever audit experiment designs where they send out resumes where they signal either different races or different sexual orientations and to potential employers and look at some of the differences in terms of whether or not individuals with stigmatized identities are hired less within a particular context, which does have, of course, economic consequences, but it's a little bit different from your question. So the short answer is no, and that's a wide open area. At least I'm not aware of any. There might be some out there, but there's a dissertation in the making, I'm sure, at least on that. So. Sure. So this question is about interrelationships between structural forms of stigma and stigma at kind of individual and interpersonal levels of analysis. Is that right? Researchers tend to study these in isolation. And your point is very well taken that they are obviously related, that in areas with more structural stigma, you tend to see greater interpersonal stigma and discrimination, and you also tend to see greater adverse psychological responses related to stigma. Let me just see if I can find this slide that I made to address this. Here we go. So one of the real challenges in the field is having data sets that actually allow you to measure structural stigma alongside individual and interpersonal forms of stigma. So in these large-scale population-based data sets like the ones that I talked about, they have really rich structural variability, right? We have variation across states, neighborhoods, communities, countries. So you're able to link in these measures of structural stigma, but they're not designed to study the stigmatized groups of interest, and so they don't have good data at all on interpersonal forms of stigma and discrimination. Conversely, psychosocial data sets that come out typically of social psychology and medical sociology, either in the lab or maybe one or two communities, have really rich data on interpersonal stigma and discrimination. But because they're done in just one or two places, there's no structural variability. So structural and institutional forms of stigma are essentially ubiquitous exposures. So there's no variability, and so therefore there's no statistical power to show that structural stigma is affecting stigma at the individual and interpersonal level of analysis. So there's been very few studies to really empirically address your question. They are hypothesized to be separate but related constructs, but showing that empirically is one of the great challenges because of the way in which our data structures are currently structured. So the study that I skipped, and probably in retrospect should not have because I would have addressed your question, I'll just mention really quickly. We had data from 38 different European countries that differed in terms of the level of structural stigma. So you can see quite a bit of variation here with the countries with the highest level of structural stigma are in red, and the countries with lower levels of structural stigma are in green. And we had a data set of gay and bisexual men living in these countries, and it asked them their experiences of interpersonal discrimination and also their psychological responses to that, including things like, do you conceal your stigmatized identity from others? And what we showed is that, and this was one of the first studies to include all three measures in one study, structural stigma, interpersonal, individual, and we showed, for example, that men report being over 2.5 times more likely to conceal their sexual orientation if they lived in high compared to low structural stigma countries. So it's one of the first studies to actually link individual experiences of stigma with structural forms of stigma. So there's a lot of theory and hypothesizing about those relationships within social psychology, but very few studies empirically able to do that because of the way data sets are set up right now. I think that was a long-winded answer to your question, but these are separate constructs, but they're mutually constitutive of each other, that one shapes the other and each shapes the other in turn. So you need these different data sets allow you to look at those kind of recursive relationships between the two to really understand how they're informing each other. And so we need a lot more work in that area to be able to to answer those questions. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I haven't worked in several different spaces in mental health care. I really appreciated what you're saying, and I've seen a lot of those trends. I am curious, like, most concrete takeaway I get from your talk is about legal manners of resolving or creating more structural inequalities. And I'm curious what recommendations you would have beyond legal measures for reducing health disparities, especially in states in which there is more structural stigma. How is it that we as people or as researchers help to reduce stigma?
Yeah, good question. So the way I should say, I guess, that I think of this work as less pinpointing the effect of law A on outcome Y. I mean, I think these laws are markers and they're proxies for structural and institutional forms of stigma, but I don't know that certainly one implication is that we should be adopting different laws and policies, but it's less about the law and policies per se and more what those laws and policies are representing about our social institutions. And of course, there's many evidence. Race is a great example of you can change laws and policies, and they're not always trickling down to change behavior. And so laws and policies are important as markers and signals within a particular context of identities that are supported or threatened or not. But they're one small piece of a much larger puzzle. I mean, stigma is such a complicated beast because stigmatizers get a lot out of stigmatizing, and so our interventions don't really think through in the way that they should. What the motivations are that underlie stigmatization, and so I have a colleague who has written a great paper where she talks about 3 functions of stigma as keeping people in, keeping people down, and keeping people away. And most of our interventions don't touch that, legally or interpersonally or individually. And so, because stigma is a multi-level construct at both individual, interpersonal, and structural levels, our interventions have to be multi-pronged. They have to hit institutional, they have to hit interpersonal, they have to hit individual. And so I wouldn't want people to come away as thinking that structural is the only way we should be going here, nor that laws and policies are the only mechanism. They're one, but they are one among many. And I guess finally what I'd say is, a lot of people, public health is guilty of often thinking that the education is the best structural intervention. If that were true, we'd all be out of business by now. But what we're seeing is that, education, trying to reduce stereotypes is somewhat effective some of the time for a very short period of time. And part of the reason that is because it's not addressing these underlying dimensions of motivations and functions of stigmatization. And so, that's partly why our current interventions have been less effective than they should be or need to be. But it also, I guess, the hopeful piece of that is that there's a lot more work that can be done in that area to really tackle those issues. So, thanks for your question. Yeah.
So in one of the studies that you presented, there was a pretty marked difference between the gay respondents and the bisexual respondents. And I was wondering, like, your explanation for that, but also how in your analysis you decide when
to separate.
whether to lump this.
Yeah, great question about, and I was hoping no one would ask me that because my this comes up every talk I give, so I should now probably have developed a better answer than I will give you. The short answer is, to be honest, I don't know why the bisexual group had a different pattern. The somewhat more satisfying but longer explanation is, I think what that really speaks to is the importance of developing structural indicators that are unique to each group. Because we know that stereotypes about bisexuality are quite, the content and nature and form of them are quite different from stereotypes related to same-sex sexualities. And also that in the Swedish study, the attitude measure that we used was related to gay men and lesbians, not bisexuality, and the laws that we included, not all of them, but many of them were specifically related to same-sex sexualities, like same-sex marriage and same-sex adoption and things like that. So if you think about those indicators, they're really much more specific to gay men and lesbians than they are to bisexual groups. So I think we need better, more work to really think through what are the indicators that would be unique to bisexual men and women, and actually develop those and study those. And there's very little, if any, work that I'm aware of that's done that. So I think that's a wide open area for that. And the second answer to your question is the reason we do that, we try to do it when we can, but in many of these data sets, we don't have large enough sample sizes for statistical reasons, so we often lump them together. Increasingly, what I'm learning is we should not be doing that. And so, especially as I've gotten more and more data suggesting those patterns are very different for those two groups. And so, I used to be a lumper, and now I'm more of a splitter in that way, yeah. So, and I think that that has implications for other stigmatized groups as well, when you're lumping different groups together and thinking about, you know, to the extent possible, trying to get large enough sample sizes to be able to look at those subgroups. Yeah, yeah, Natalie.
Thank you so much. This was really
Thanks.
wonderful. You mentioned when measuring the attitudes and beliefs of members of the community, when you're measuring the amount of stigma and the stereotypes that they have, you mentioned that there's that social desirability of it.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, since perhaps November 8th, and is that been marked in a data set in any way? Because we seem to think that folks appear more emboldened to
Right.
say what they
Right.
want to say
Right.
after that recent election. And do you think that will lead to an exacerbation or get larger differences or larger effect sizes in some of the disparities that you're already
Seeing, yeah. So I have a close colleague who studies the impact of racism on health and health disparities, and she said she would have to spend the first half of all of her talks convincing people that racism and prejudice still exist. And she said, I never thought I would ever say this, but I am thankful for Donald Trump for this one thing, which is I now don't have to give the first 30 minutes of my talk. Like, people get it. So I think that I'm not aware of, I'm more aware of studies showing increases, and a lot of this is anecdotal, so I think there's some challenges in getting really good data on this, but definitely seeing behavioral differences before and after in terms of increases in victimization and hate crime rates related to some of the political discourse. I haven't seen good attitudinal data to see if people are now more, if some of the old measures of prejudice in the GSS, if there's a big uptick. But that my hypothesis would be that we are seeing that and that would be reflected. I only know of one piece in the New England Journal of Medicine that kind of cited this work and many other studies showing that if this work is true, we will see larger disparities in the years moving forward. And so I think we'll have to wait for the data to come out and see if that's the case. But I think certainly the laws and policies and attitudes are rapidly shifting again in directions that are not good for many stigmatized groups. And so my expectation based on this work and those of others is that we're going to see that translating into health consequences, both short-term and long-term.
So would you say then that this is talking about the role of cortisol in mental and physical health, the impact of cortisol? I mean, trying to come down to the very center of what it is that we're seeing happen?
Yeah. At a mechanistic level, you mean? Well, I mean, I think that cortisol has certainly been associated with adverse mental and physical health outcomes, but it's just one marker of a much more complicated physiologic system. We have some data now where we're looking at, we're still doing analyses, so I don't know the results, but there's this concept of allostatic load that most physiological researchers are using now, which is this idea that it's wear and tear across multiple systems: neuroendocrine, cardiometabolic, immunologic, inflammatory. And so we have a data set now where all of those have been measured. Those different markers have been measured across those different physiologic systems. And we have respondents from high and low structural stigma groups. And so we're going to look to see whether those or whether living in high structural stigma states is associated with greater allostatic load. So we'll have a better sense of some of the physiologic mechanisms. But there are clear psychological mechanisms too. There are direct economic, there there are multiple mechanisms through which structural stigma operates to produce disadvantage. There are these physiologic pathways. There are more resource pathways getting to this economics question. I mean, marriage was a good example. There are 1,132 benefits that were associated with marriage that came with social benefits, financial benefits, employment non-discrimination, you can still be legally fired in 29 states because of your sexual orientation and gender identity now. That comes with clear resource pathways in terms of your finances. But then there are real psychological mechanisms around things like, threat evaluation and belongingness and social evaluation, social support. So I think it's multiply mediated across those different systems. But I think we need more work to really tease apart those different mechanisms, but there's already, I think, emerging evidence suggesting that we're seeing it across those different systems. So it's definitely not just as simple as it all comes back to cortisol, but I think there's certainly a stress. Stress is one of the main mechanisms we're seeing, but certainly not the only one. Yeah.
I really appreciated your talk.
Thank you.
I really like the fact that the future direction is about evaluation of our efforts. Memphis has a lot of efforts in prevention of obesity, breaking diabetes, and there's a lot of efforts towards social determinants of health, addressing those determinants. And as these groups are convening and we're trying to create good solutions, I don't want to be in that state that our efforts are not effective.
Right.
And so as we're going into these discussions, what would you suggest for us to continue this work?
Yeah. Well, so it's a great question, and it's a tough answer. I mean, I think partly it's just the fact that you're aware of that. I mean, awareness is a huge piece of this, because psychologists, and I'm guilty of this, and my colleagues are guilty of this, we are interested in sort of generalizable psychological principles, and so we think everything is going to be the same across social contexts, and of course that's not the case. Our work and plenty of other studies are showing this. So just trying to understand the context in which these interventions are being delivered is huge, and starting to actually measure those things, measure them and link them to health outcomes, and link them to the efficacy of your interventions. Are you seeing that your interventions are more or less effective in different contexts? Strategically choose the context in which you're implementing those interventions and measure to see whether there are differences in the effectiveness of those interventions across different contexts. Researchers they're not doing any of those things. So anything you will do will be pushing that field forward, and will be a contribution in its own right. So thinking at the same, and this gets back to the earlier point about individual, interpersonal, structural, thinking about all of those together at the same time, and how does the structure and the context affect interpersonal interactions in the healthcare setting and other settings, and also the individual lived experience of people. Keeping all those in your mind at the same time when you're thinking about interventions is important, and not done nearly as much as it should be. So. That's it? I mean, I can keep going, but I think they've heard enough from me.
You up there as long as you're willing, but we don't want to overtire you. And I think this is a reception.
Great.
So please, we hope you'll join us, and thank you again.
Yeah, thanks so much.